And there we go.
Hello again. This is the History and Theory lecture for Queer Studies, and this has to do with some questions and ideas. And we can go to the next slide, please. So what is theory? Theory gets talked about a lot, but what is it exactly? If we're looking at the slide, it's usually a lot of reading, and that certainly has a lot to do with it. But history is a set of ideas, and essentially it's a set of ideas that puts a structure to thoughts. So it's an overlying structure to thoughts. It's a conceptual guide. And certainly within queer studies, it provides conceptual guides to a lot of thoughts, which can very often be random. It's also a study of process. It's a study of how we put our ideas in order. So in this case, it's a study of how we put our ideas about queer and trans studies in order. And there certainly have been a lot of different ideas from different sources throughout the history of this field, which is short. But certainly the history of queerness and transness is not short, as we'll see. So instead of a search for single origins, we're going to conceive of processes, interconnected ideas that cannot necessarily be disentangled, but we can look at a larger process and identify that if we put an order to it, a conceptual order. And that's what theory is. So very often theory has a lot of larger words, big terms that are not very familiar. But once we become familiar with the terms, we can apply them to a conceptual process and order our thoughts in an easier way. So this is what Joan Wallach Scott said in 1986, and she was the historian who really started the idea of women's studies and was the founder, one of the founders of the study of women's studies, which is where the idea of the academic field of queer studies started. So women's studies, gender studies, queer studies. Okay, next slide, please. So what are some ways to approach and apply some of the materials of queer studies? Well, one of the places that we start, or at least that I start in this class, are to look at older theoretical texts, older historical materials. And in this case, we look at some narrative texts, some narrative ideas. We'll start with the films before Stonewall and after Stonewall to get some idea of events, and we'll look at the difference between event history, narrative history, and theoretical history. We'll look at some classic theory, that would be Foucault and Butler, and we'll look at what we're using as tools for analysis. In other words, how are we looking at history? How are we thinking about history? And do we have to think about history in only one way, which is usually a linear way? And we'll talk about history in class. Usually about half students hate history and the other half of the students want to know more about history. So we're going to think about history and how we're thinking about history, because how we think about what we think is just as important. And then we're going to look at how we're thinking about queer studies, which sounds like doublespeak, and it kind of is. But how are we thinking about our ideas about queer studies and using practical, how we can use them in our thoughts and our concepts in practical real world applications for our lives, for our work, and for our actions in the real world. Again, whether it's our work, our art, coming out, our families, our health, or our prime concern right now, which is natural resources, saving the planet, economics, politics, all of which are bound up together. So we're going to look at all of these. Sounds like a tall order in 6 weeks, but I'm pretty sure we can do it. Okay. Next slide, please. So history and archives versus current materials. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, why should we care about older sources, or should we care about older ideas at all? So some of the older materials that we look at are Leslie Feinberg, who wrote Stone Butch Blues and Transgender Warriors. And Leslie Feinberg was one of the first to identify and come out as trans in the 60s, 70s, and to really sort of put this out in writing, fiction, nonfiction, and be an activist at the same time. One of the first authors who we were all first aware of if we were coming out in the 60s and 70s. And of course, there were people before that who were doing this too. But one of the first in current popular culture to do this. And if we read these now older than contemporary, for those of us who are my age, folks who were really trailblazers in early gay, lesbian, feminist, queer, popular, and now trans popular culture, we find that the ideas of current queer philosophers like Sara Ahmed are reflected in really similar concepts, language, ideas. And we find that the fight is not new. The fight is never new. It very often is the language, the format, and the vehicle for getting it into popular culture. And you find that certainly in Black Lives Matter, in the Asian Lives Matter, in the Latinx Lives Matter. You find that the fight is not new, that the questions are not new, that the issues are not new, but the event might be new, but that the fight, for those of us who have been activists all our lives, the questions sound alarmingly repetitive, but the energy is new, which is wonderful, and that we have to keep up the fight. So the archives versus current material, very important to show that the struggle is ongoing and that the fight still matters. And next slide, please. So strategies for reading, and I always talk about this, and I have a reading sheet which I will put on Google Classroom. What are some strategies for reading? And I talk about how to manage difficult terms. Of course, please look them up. How do we deal with dense text? How do we deal with unfamiliar jargon and unwieldy concepts? So what I suggest is take the time. Take the time to learn new concepts. If you are taking, for instance, an art class or a design class that is new to you, or a science class that is new to you, you have to take the time to learn the terminology of that discipline, any academic discipline. If you're learning a new job, if you join a union and you become an electrician, you are studying to learn the tools of that trade. You have to learn to speak in the language of that trade in order to get licensed. It's the same thing. In queer studies, there is language. In social sciences, there is language. You have to learn to speak in the disciplines of that new trade, of that new academic discipline, of that new art or design field. So in order to become conversant in that new field, it is upon you to take the time to learn the tools of that trade in order to speak the language of that trade, of that field, of that discipline, in order to advance in that field and become conversant in it. Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to teach it, but if you want to advance in it and step up the ladder in that field, take the time. So having said that, there are tricks to reading, and we'll talk about those further in the class. There are tricks to reading difficult texts that all graduate students know, and all teachers know they know them, that will get you through texts without bogging you down. And we can talk more about that, and we can talk more about academic support beyond the scope of this video. And I promise you, we will do that, because some of these texts are difficult and dense, and we will talk more about how to do that when we get into class. And next slide, please. So theory versus personal narrative. And this is important in the context of this class, because we do a lot of history, we do a lot of social science, sociology. In what ways can personal narrative be connected to theory? In what ways can linear history be be germane to theory? Most of you learned history as linear narrative, even as personal narrative, you know, the story of great men and dates and places and all that. And most of you couldn't stand it because it didn't seem to be germane to you or familiar to you, or you didn't seem to have a place in it. And I understand that. I went through that my own self. But I loved history for what history did not tell me. Where were the women? Where were the queer people? Where were the underclass people? Where were the people who were called slaves at the time? Where were the people of color? Where were the people who never got mentioned? Where were the people whose stories didn't get told? Where were the people who couldn't read and write? Where were the people who they didn't make the statues of? Where were the people who lost the wars, et cetera, et cetera? So those were the people that I wanted to know about, and they didn't appear in most places. So there are all sorts of reasons for doing history to find the people whose names didn't get spoken, whose records didn't get written down, who didn't win the wars or the battles, who weren't sitting on the thrones, who were maybe standing behind them. There are all sorts of reasons for that. So those are the people that we're going to look at in this class, and we're going to find out who was invisible in history, who didn't have voices. And so that's why theory is important. Theory about why and about what was going on behind the front narrative, behind the arras, Shakespeare would say. And who is Shakespeare anyway, by the way? There's a book called Queer Shakespeare. So there is that. So both personal narrative and what kinds of sources you would use for invisible people are very important in this class. And how to do history differently are important in this class. And then looking at theory, because there is no history for a lot of this, is important in this class. And in the absence of history in terms of issues like records or history that was left by the winners, you could say, then where do you find history? Where do you find history, for people like us? Personal narrative, letters, personal letters, oral history. Where do you find that? A lot of where you substitute it is theory. So, and personal artifacts, art, personal items, things that would not have been considered history by the Academy, but now, thanks to women's history, feminist history, Black history, Latinx history, Asian history, et cetera, economic history, class history, now it is considered history. So yes, theory, absolutely important. And the combination of histories, now queer history, trans history, it's all getting done now, or it's not all getting done now, but it should be all getting done now, or more and more getting done. Now it's all having a visibility and a representation that it didn't before, and queer studies is part of that representation. So the combinations of histories that were never done before, in addition to linear narrative history of the patriarchy, are what's important. So we'll take a look at how we do history, which is called historiography, in this class. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the people who, and I mentioned this in the first video, who first taught us to think differently about history is Michel Foucault, who's a French philosopher. He was gay. He thought we should be doing history differently. And so he did it. He thought about it differently. and he presented us with a theory called deconstruction. And he gave the opportunity for all of us to look differently at events and to look differently at history and traditional fields like philosophy, history, sociology, literature. And he really presented the founders of queer studies in the academy with the bedrock for ripping apart traditional fields and looking at a paradigm that was completely different and wasn't linear. And so I spelled historian wrong. I apologize. He might have appreciated that, but I'll go back and fix that. But the way to look at things differently is not by looking back and pasting a model of current culture onto past cultures. So we're going to read some of Foucault and take a look at how he thought about history differently and thought about history in terms of possibilities and queerness and why that was so important in the formation of queer studies. Okay, next. Now, my favorite queer scholar is Sara Ahmed, who is a lesbian feminist Muslim from Australia who worked in the academy in England and until she quit over the unfair representation of Title IX issues in her university in England, and is now an independent academic, she calls herself. She lives with her partner and her dogs somewhere and just writes incredible stuff. We're going to read some Sara Ahmed. Anything you read by Sara Ahmed is appropriate to this course, but also to life in general, because she believes in queerness, in transness, in otherness, in being different, and in standing outside the academy and outside the patriarchy and outside heteronormativity as a political statement and as a viable life, happy, whole alternative, which I think is absolutely brilliant. Her writing is brilliant. Again, my favorite queer philosopher, my favorite queer author, and we're going to read some Sara Ahmed, and I hope that you follow up on reading more Sara Ahmed as your life continues. She's a terrific scholar and a terrific writer, and she ends up to be a favorite of many in this class. Okay, next. Judith Butler. Judith Butler is an American philosopher, world-renowned queer philosopher, lesbian identified, who really talks about all sorts of queer issues and was maybe, excuse me, among the first to really be identified broadly with queer issues. Talks about something called performativity, which is the unconscious, repetitive, subconscious, repetitive performance of queer and trans ritual in society. And she's can be a little bit difficult to understand. And she first talked about gender trouble. That was her first book. That was my first introduction to Judith Butler. And she has since updated some of her issues. I find that she can be a little bit difficult to read, but when you get Judith Butler in video, she's really quite charming and a little bit easier to understand. Very important to the whole field, academic field of queer studies in general, and an activist. She donates her time, does a lot of service, and is very important to the idea of the queer lens and the idea of identity being something that is about self and not about the other, which we're going to talk about more. So Foucault, Butler, and then Eve Sedgwick, who we read first, very important to the formation of the academic field of queer studies. And then Sarah Ahmed, I think somebody who was very positive about queer identity in the 21st century. And next. So we're going to talk more. I think we can take a break here, Guilford, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. I can stop recording right now.
Great, thanks, because it's sort of